At the height of the empire's power, when maps bent under her name and foreign courts trembled at her seal, the queen vanished without a funeral, without a decree, without a single honest explanation. One night, candles were extinguished in her wing of the palace, guards were doubled at her doors, and by morning she was no longer seen by her people. Official records claimed illness, courtiers whispered madness, enemies smiled and moved on. Behind those locked doors, the woman who had signed wars into existence and peace into memory was reduced to silence, watched more closely than any prisoner, denied the very authority she once embodied. The empire continued to expand, banners still flew, coins still bore her face, but the queen herself was erased while still breathing. History would later pretend this disappearance was mercy. In truth, it was the beginning of a punishment far crueler than death, before silence claimed her. The queen had been everywhere, at once sun battle maps spread across oak tables, in council chambers thick with incense and ambition, in letters sent across seas carrying her will. She was not born powerful by accident. She learned power early, surviving a court where alliances shifted faster than loyalties and mercy was seen as weakness. As a ruler, she balanced war and diplomacy with calculated restraint, knowing when to display iron and when to offer velvet. The empire, under her command, grew not only through conquest, but through administration, law, and fear tempered with order. Merchants prospered, borders stabilized, and her name became synonymous with continuity in an unstable age. Yet her authority unsettled those closest to her. Advisors who once depended on her favor began to resent her independence. Male relatives, elevated by her crown, quietly questioned whether the empire should still answer to a woman whose legitimacy they could not fully control. Whispers began as concerns for her health, her judgment. Her temperament carefully planted doubts designed to sound reasonable rather than treasonous. Publicly, she remained composed, issuing decrees and presiding over ceremonies with unshaken dignity. Privately, she sensed the shift, the way conversations stopped when she entered, the way decisions were increasingly made in rooms she was no longer invited into. The empire appeared stable, even flourishing, but beneath its polished surface, the mechanisms of her removal were already turning, slow and deliberate, preparing to close around her life like unseen locks. The moment came without drama, without raised voices or drawn blades, which made it all the more final. A sealed document was placed before her during what was announced as a routine council meeting. The language was respectful, almost tender, filled with concern for her well-being and the stability of the realm. It suggested rest, seclusion, protection from the burdens of rule. Every sentence was shaped to sound like care, yet each line quietly stripped authority from her hands. When she looked up, she saw not conspirators, but men who refused to meet her eyes. Her protest was measured, deliberate. She reminded them of treaties she had negotiated, of borders she had defended, of crises she had steered the empire through. While they advised from safety, the room remained calm. That was their greatest weapon. Calm turned resistance into proof, composure into suspicion. By the end of the meeting, the decision had already been recorded, witnessed, and sealed. Her signature was no longer required. That evening, the palace changed. Guards she did not recognize replaced familiar faces. Corridors she had walked freely since her coronation were suddenly restricted. Her personal attendants were reassigned, dismissed, or instructed to speak only when spoken to. By nightfall, her apartments were surrounded not by ceremony, but by surveillance. Doors that had never been locked were closed from the outside, softly, almost apologetically. She stood alone in rooms still decorated with symbols of her reign, listening to the palace settle into sleep without her command. In that stillness, the truth became unavoidable. She had not been overthrown in battle or exposed in scandal. She had been neutralized, legally, quietly, and forever. The empire had chosen order over loyalty, and in doing so, had broken its queen without ever needing to raise a hand. Days lost their names first, then weeks. Light entered her chambers only when permitted, filtered through heavy curtains that dulled both color and memory. The rooms were not a dungeon. They were worse furnished, orderly, and utterly devoid of purpose. Silence pressed in from every wall, broken only by the measured steps of guards outside her door and the soft, rehearsed voices of servants instructed never to linger. Conversation was reduced to necessities. Questions went unanswered. She was allowed books, but not correspondence. Allowed prayers, but not confession. Allowed to walk, but only in enclosed corridors where windows revealed nothing of the world she once governed. The empire existed beyond those walls, yet she experienced it only through fragment changes in guard rotations, new uniforms, unfamiliar crests replacing her own. Each detail reminded her that decisions were still being made, just not by her. At night, memory became her only companion. She replayed councils, negotiations, moments where compromise had spared thousands, wondering which mercy had been interpreted as weakness. Sleep arrives in pieces, interrupted by the certainty that history was being rewritten, while she remained awake and powerless to stop it. No trial was announced, no sentence declared. Her confinement had no name, which made it endless. What unsettled her most was not fear, but invisibility. The queen still lived, still breathed, still thought with clarity, yet she no longer officially existed. Isolation was not simply punishment. It was erasure in slow motion. And as the doors remained locked, and the world beyond continued unbothered, she understood that survival itself had become another form of suffering. Humiliation did not arrive all at once. It was delivered carefully, disguised as protocol. She was informed of changes rather than consulted, corrected on matters she had once defined, addressed with titles that sounded respectful but carried no authority. Requests were acknowledged, then delayed until they became irrelevant. The message was consistent and deliberate. She was to observe, not influence. Occasionally, officials were permitted to see her, not to seek guidance, but to measure her compliance. They spoke slowly, as one speaks to someone presumed fragile, explaining imperial decisions she had authored in earlier years as if they were distant history. When she questioned inconsistencies, notes were taken. When she insisted on context, her tone was recorded. Each response became evidence, not of treason, but of instability. Dignity itself was reframed as defiance. Servants changed again. The new ones avoided eye contact, trained to report not words, but moods. A sigh, a pause before answering, a refusal to smile, everything was observed. Even her silence was interpreted. The queen learned that defending herself only deepened the narrative forming around her. a story written by others and delivered to the outside world without her consent. The cruelest moments came through absence. No proclamations bore her seal. No celebrations marked her name. When victories were announced, they were credited to regents and councils, men who had once stood behind her throne. She listened as the empire spoke of continuity, stability, and progress, terms that excluded her by design. In stripping her of public presence, they dismantled her identity piece by piece. The humiliation was not loud or theatrical. It was administrative, systematic, and effective. Power, she realized, did not need to be taken by force. It could be dissolved quietly until the person who once held it remained only as a shadow. Present yet permanently unheard, the confrontation arrived without an audience. No banners, no accusations read aloud, no formal charges to answer. Instead, a small delegation entered her chambers, carrying documents already finalized. They spoke of necessity, of the empire's safety, of decisions made in her best interest. The language was flawless, legal, compassionate, irreversible. This was not a trial meant to determine guilt. It was a confirmation of a verdict decided long before she was informed. She was offered a choice that was not truly a choice. Accept permanent withdrawal from public life in exchange for comfort and dignity, or resist and risk measures that would force the issue. The threat was never defined. It did not need to be. By now, she understood how power operated when it no longer required justification. She responded with calm clarity. She did not beg, nor did she rage. She reminded them that empires were not sustained by fear alone, but by legitimacy, by the belief that rule followed law rather than convenience. For a brief moment, the room faltered, not because they disagreed, but because they recognized their truth of her words and chose to proceed anyway. The documents were signed without her name. A statement was prepared for the public, praising her past service while confirming her retirement from affairs of state. Her fate was sealed with ink, not chains. As they departed, she was left standing in a chamber that felt suddenly smaller. There would be no appeal, no record of resistance. History would not record this meeting as a fall, only as a transition. And yet, in that quiet confrontation, the empire crossed a line it would never openly acknowledge, condemning its queen while preserving the illusion of justice. Time no longer moved forward for her. It circled. Seasons changed only through temperature, through the weight of air in her chambers, through the quiet replacement of tapestries bearing symbols she once chose herself. She was alive, yet treated as someone already concluded. No visitors arrived without purpose. No messages reached her without permission. Even her reflection began to feel unfamiliar, as if the woman in the glass belonged to an earlier chapter of history. There was no execution, no final walk, no dramatic ending the world could witness. Instead, her last moments as a ruler stretched, endlessly diluted into routine. She learned to measure survival in restraint, what not to say, what not to ask, what memories to keep unspoken. The discipline that had once governed an empire was now used to govern herself. Occasionally, distant sounds reached her window, bells marking victories, celebrations for heirs she would never meet, ceremonies that once required her presence. Each sound confirmed that the empire had learned to breathe without her. That knowledge cut deeper than any blade, not because she desired power back, but because she understood what had been lost, accountability, memory, and truth. In quiet hours, she prepared herself for a disappearance, not in body, but in record. She repeated her own name in prayer, fearing that even it might fade if left unspoken too long. When illness finally came, it was met not with urgency, but with procedure. Comfort was allowed. Witnesses were few. Her passing was noted politely, filed efficiently, and announced briefly. The Queen died as she had lived her final years contained, controlled, and carefully removed from consequence. The doors remained locked even after she was gone. The empire did not pause when news of her death was released. There were no days of mourning declared, no public procession, no monuments raised in her name. The announcement was brief, respectful, and strategically quiet. Official records described her final years as peaceful, her withdrawal as voluntary, her absence as necessary. Stability was emphasized. Continuity was praised. The empire moved forward, satisfied with its version of events. Yet stories have a way of surviving order. In border towns, in private letters never meant for archives, in conversations spoken too softly for a record, her name endured. People remembered the years when laws were enforced without cruelty, when decisions carried responsibility rather than convenience. Scholars later noticed gaps, missing decrees, altered dates, sudden shifts in authority that could not be fully explained. Her disappearance became a question no document could answer cleanly. Generations later, historians would debate whether she had been ill, misled, or deliberately removed. None could prove the truth completely. That uncertainty became her legacy. She stood as a reminder that power does not always fall in spectacle. Sometimes it is quietly locked away, allowed to fade while institutions protect themselves. The Queen who ruled an empire did not fall on a battlefield, nor was she defeated by rebellion. She was erased while alive, preserved only in fragments and doubt. And in those unanswered questions, history was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most effective cruelty is the kind that leaves no visible scars, only locked doors, and a silence that refuses to explain itself.